Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're diving deep into an industry that, well, quite literally touches nearly every single life on the planet. Pharmaceuticals.
It really does. It's an industry with roots stretching back millennia, built on this human quest for healing. But today, it's navigating this incredibly complex space between groundbreaking science, really strict regulation, and the demands of global business.
Yeah, it's a lot, and we've got a substantial stack of sources here, everything from ancient historical accounts and research papers to, recent articles really charting this industry's journey from old herbal remedies to the massive global powerhouses it is today.
And our mission really is to cut through that complexity for you, to give you a shortcut through this huge history, pulling out the absolutely essential knowledge and some genuinely surprising, maybe even shocking facts, and really getting to grips with why this industry is constantly making headlines, for life-saving breakthroughs on one hand.
And major controversies on the other.
Yes, exactly.
It's definitely a story of scientific triumphs born out of necessity, I guess, and curiosity, but also one shaped profoundly by regulatory battles and, always, that tension between innovation and profit.
Okay, let's start unraveling this right at the beginning.
Right, the very beginning. So the quest for healing isn't new, it's ancient history. Our sources, they highlight how cultures like the Chinese, Hindu, Mediterranean, they were using plants, animals, minerals for therapeutic purposes thousands of years ago.
Right, like things we still vaguely recognize.
Yeah, think about Shan used for fevers in ancient China. We now know it has compounds that act like antimalarials, or Egyptian senna and castor oil as laxatives. Even the Greek physician Galen, back in the 1st century AD, he was documenting the use of opium. So they were observing effects, creating remedies, even if they didn't understand the chemistry behind it all. Okay, so they're observing, using things, but bringing some level of consistency to that must have been a critical step.
Oh, absolutely. And the sources point to the first pharmacopoeia starting to pop up in the 16th and 17th centuries.
Like official recipe books.
Kind of, yeah. They weren't just random lists. These were official texts, like the one in Nuremberg in 1546 or London in 1618, listing recognized drugs, giving specific instructions. It's like the very early seeds of standardization, a recognition that you needed some consistency in preparing medicines.
Okay, consistency starts, and then the 1800s. That seems like where things really accelerate.
Oh, the 1800s changed everything. This is where scientists started isolating the active ingredients from these natural sources. This was revolutionary.
Isolating, so pulling out the specific chemical.
Exactly. Imagine extracting morphine from opium around 1804. They even named it after Morpheus, the god of dreams.
Wow.
Then came quinine for malaria, colchicine for gout, atropine, cocaine from coca leaves.
So why was that so important? Just knowing what it was?
It was more than just knowing, because for the first time you could purify these potent compounds, know exactly how much you were giving someone. You could achieve precise dosing, moving way beyond just, giving someone a chunk of a raw plant and hoping for the best.
Wow, yeah. Precise dosing from a plant extract that feels like a monumental shift. And it wasn't just extracts, right? Sources mentioned other big chemical innovations.
Absolutely. Think about anesthetics. Ether in 1842, chloroform in 1847. These weren't just small tweaks. They completely revolutionized surgery.
Right.
Made procedures possible that were just unthinkable before because of the pain.
Right. Unlocking surgery.
And Edward Jenner's smallpox vaccine in the late 1700s, though a bit earlier, was a monumental leap in prevention, not just treatment. A true game changer that really set the stage for vaccinology.
Okay, so we have these individual breakthroughs, morphine, anesthesia, vaccines. How do we get from that to the modern pharmaceutical industry as we kind of recognize it now?
Well, that crystallization really happened in the mid to late 1800s, particularly in places like Germany, Switzerland, and the US. And here's a surprising link. German dye manufacturers were actually key.
Dye manufacturers?
Well, they'd mastered chemical synthesis, making dyes from coal tar. And scientists realized they could use these skills to systematically alter chemical structures and then test their biological effects. This forged that direct link between chemistry and pharmacology. It started turning medicine from, let's say, more of a craft
into a science.
Into a rigorous scientific endeavor focused on creating new, consistent drugs based on chemistry.
So the industry really has these two distinct origins then. You've got the traditional apothecaries, the medicine mixers,
right,
and then these cutting-edge chemical labs discovering things almost by accident or by design.
Exactly. You had roots in traditional apothecaries and the wholesale drug suppliers. That's where companies like Merck, Schering, Roche, and U.S. firms like Abbott, Lilly, Squibb kind of came from. And alongside them, you had the chemical and dye companies realizing their chemical expertise had medical potential, like Bayer, Ciba, eventually Pfizer.
And you mentioned early, U.S. pharmacists were key local manufacturers before things scaled up.
Yes, they were vital locally, but wholesale distribution really took off in the early 20th century. That's what turned it into a truly national enterprise, no longer just limited by local production.
It's fascinating to see the individual stories behind these giants, like GSK tracing back to a London pharmacy in 1715.
Right, or SmithKline starting in Philadelphia in 1830.
And those quirky details, like Thomas Beecham, who was apparently a former shepherd, building the UK's first factory with electricity just for his laxative pills.
Yeah, or Squibb pioneering the standardization of digitalis, a heart medicine, and then building the world's largest penicillin plant during World War II.
It's like all these different threads weave together to form the groundwork for the industry today.
Which brings us inevitably to policy, because the industry we know now is incredibly regulated, but that wasn't always the case, not even close. The era before 1906 in the U.S., often called the Wild West, and for very good reason.
Oh, I've heard about this, the patent medicines, the snake oil stuff.
Exactly. Thousands of concoctions sold with these wild claims to cure everything, often containing hidden large amounts of narcotics, morphine, heroin, opium, or just plain high levels of alcohol.
And critically, no ingredient labels, right? No warnings.
None. And the sources have some truly shocking details here, like soothing syrups given to babies that contained narcotics.
Oh my God, seriously.
It's appalling. These syrups led to widespread infant addiction. It was the investigative journalists, the muckrakers of the era, who really exposed this lack of safety and quality in these quack medicines. That sparked major public outrage. People were furious.
And that outcry, that's what led to the first significant federal law, the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906.
Yes, the Wiley Act. It was heavily influenced by things like Upton Sinclair's novel, The Jungle, which exposed the meatpacking industry, but raised general awareness in chemist Harvey W. Wiley's famous Poison Squad experiments.
Poison Squad, what was that?
Wiley had volunteers, mostly young men working at the Department of Agriculture, who agreed to eat meals containing common food additives of the time, things like borax, formaldehyde, to see what happened. It was pretty dramatic proof of potential harm.
Wow. Okay, so the Wiley Act, what did it actually do?
It was a first step. It banned adulteration, meaning impure or decomposed ingredients, and misbranding. Crucially, it required listing certain addictive or dangerous ingredients, like opium and alcohol, on the labels.
So you had to say if it had booze or opiates in it.
Right. It also set some basic purity standards.
Yep.
But it was largely a truth in labeling law. It didn't require companies to prove a drug was safe before selling it.
So it didn't actually stop unsafe products from being sold, as long as you listed the dodgy ingredients.
Precisely. And that limitation, well, it had catastrophic consequences. A major tragedy in 1937, the elixir sulfanilamide disaster, directly caused the next giant leap in regulation.
What happened there?
A company needed a liquid form of a new sulfa drug, sulfanilamide. To dissolve it, they used diethylene glycol, which is chemically similar to antifreeze, without testing it for safety in humans.
Antifreeze. Oh, no.
Over 100 people died, many of them children. It was horrific. This single event, this tragedy, directly propelled the passage of the 1938 Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, the FDCA.
Okay, so this was the big one.
This was monumental because the FDCA required manufacturers for the first time to prove a new drug's safety before it could be marketed.
Before, not after people died.
Exactly, before. It also expanded the FDA's oversight beyond just food and drugs to include cosmetics and medical devices. It mandated safe use directions on labels and allowed the FDA to inspect factories. And another contamination issue shortly after, in 1941, where a sulfathiazole drug contaminated with a sedative killed about 300 people, just reinforced how vital these safety checks were.
It really seems like regulation in this industry's history is just born out of disaster again and again.
The pattern is pretty undeniable looking at the sources. And another global crisis in 1962 reinforced it again, the thalidomide scandal.
Thalidomide.
Right.
That caused birth defects, right? Mostly in Europe.
Yes, terrible birth deformities. Thalidomide was sold as a sleeping pill, sometimes for morning sickness. It caused thousands of babies to be born with severely malformed limbs.
Wasn't there an FDA officer who kind of held the line in the U.S.?
Yes, famously, Dr. Frances O. Kelsey. She was an FDA medical officer reviewing the application. She resisted enormous pressure from the drug company to approve thalidomide quickly in the U.S. She kept asking for more safety data, particularly about potential nerve damage she saw in the studies. Her persistence delayed approval just long enough for the horrific news from Europe to become widely known.
Wow. So her diligence prevented a similar tragedy in the U.S.
Pretty much. Her stand made her a national hero and directly spurred the Kefauver-Harris Amendments of 1962.
Okay, another set of amendments. What did these change? Safety was already required?
These changed things again significantly. They required proof not just of safety, but of efficacy.
Efficacy, meaning it actually works.
Exactly. Manufacturers now had to prove, through adequate and well-controlled investigations, basically, proper clinical trials, that their drug not only wasn't harmful, that was the 1938 rule, but also that it actually worked for what they claimed it did.
That's huge. So this is where modern clinical trials really come from.
Pretty much the birth of them as we know them today, yes. The amendments also formalized good manufacturing practices, or GMPs, strict standards for how drugs have to be made to ensure quality and consistency. Plus, they required reporting of adverse events discovered after approval and mandated informed consent for people participating in clinical trials.
So looking back at this whole regulatory journey, the really striking insight is that these major policy shifts weren't proactively planned. They were almost always reactions.
Reactions to public health failures and tragedies. Exactly. The definition of what constitutes a safe and effective drug has constantly evolved, raising the bar and increasing the burden of proof on manufacturers, but usually after something terrible happened.
And I guess that increased burden, having to prove safety and efficacy with complex trials, that likely contributes to the high cost of drug development we hear about.
No doubt. Which then leads to later policies trying to kind of balance things out, like the Hatch-Waxman Act in 1984.
The Hatch-Waxman. That was about generics, wasn't it?
Yes. It aimed to do two things: incentivize brand name innovation, partly by offering things like patent term extensions, while also creating an expedited pathway for generic drugs.
Those affordable copies of brand name drugs.
Exactly. Through something called abbreviated new drug applications, or ANDAs. Basically, generics don't have to repeat all the costly original safety and efficacy trials. They just need to show their version is bioequivalent. It gets into the bloodstream the same way.
And that act had a massive impact on affordability, didn't it?
Huge. Our sources showed generic prescriptions went from maybe 19% of the market in 1984 to over 90% today. A really significant impact on access and cost for patients.
Okay. And then more recently, things like the Affordable Care Act. How did that impact pharma?
Well, the ACA expanded health insurance coverage for millions, which obviously grew the customer base for pharmaceuticals. But it also introduced new requirements for drug discounts and rebates, especially in government programs like Medicaid. And it included provisions for 12 years of data exclusivity for biologics.
Biologics. Those are the complex drugs made from living cells, right? Like insulin or vaccines.
Exactly. Very complex, often very expensive to develop. So that exclusivity was meant to encourage innovation in that specific area.
Okay, here's something else our sources touch on, which often comes up in debates: the role of public funding.
Yeah.
Is it true that a lot of the foundational science for new drugs comes from places like the NIH or universities, funded by taxpayers?
Yes, that's a critical point the sources definitely raise. A significant amount of the early-stage basic research that identifies drug targets or pathways often originates in publicly funded labs. Private industry then takes that foundational research, develops specific drug candidates, runs the clinical trials, and commercializes the final product.
Which leads to that tricky question about the fairness of drug pricing and who really profits from that initial public investment in the science.
It's a central debate, yeah.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit. The 20th century saw just incredible scientific breakthroughs that fundamentally reshaped both the industry and, well, global healthcare.
Absolutely. I mean, where do you even start? The accidental discovery of penicillin by Alexander Fleming in 1928.
Right, the moldy Petri dish.
Exactly. And its later mass production, especially during World War II, it just revolutionized medicine, turned bacterial infections from potential death sentences into treatable conditions. Sulfonamides came along too, and then streptomycin for tuberculosis. Huge impact.
An insulin. That was discovered around then too.
1921. Completely transformed diabetes management. Before insulin, a type 1 diabetes diagnosis was basically a death sentence.
And the polio vaccine, I mean, that virtually wiped out a terrifying disease.
Dramatically reduced cases globally, yeah. Brought us incredibly close to eradication. Though it is important, as the sources note, to acknowledge that even in these moments of scientific triumph, the ethical standards weren't always what they are today. Some early vaccine trials, including Salk's work on polio, involved testing on unconsenting subjects, often in institutions.
That's a really jarring detail, isn't it? Even amid such a positive breakthrough. What about oral contraceptives?
Approved in 1960. Massive societal impact. Gave millions of women control over ovulation, Planned Parenthood, and also turned out to be helpful for managing other medical conditions, too.
And then you have the workhorses, like aspirin, synthesized way back in 1897, still a staple over a century later for pain, inflammation, even preventing heart attacks. Amazing longevity.
It really is. But then you also have drugs that had perhaps unforeseen consequences later on.
Okay.
Well, think about benzodiazepines. Drugs like Librium, Valium, Xanax. They emerged as really important treatments for anxiety in the mid-20th century. But decades later, their addictive properties became much clearer, leading to more cautious prescribing. Shows how understanding evolves.
And it's not just the drugs themselves, right? Innovation happens in how they're delivered, too.
Oh, absolutely. Innovations in drug delivery systems, think controlled release capsules that work all day, long-acting injectables, even cutting-edge nanomedicine finding new ways to target drugs. These have significantly improved patient life, too, making medicines work better or longer or with fewer side effects.
Okay, so that's the science side. What does the actual market look like now? How did we get these absolutely enormous pharmaceutical companies we see today?
Yeah, the landscape is constantly being reshaped by mega mergers. Companies buy each other up on a massive scale.
We're talking big money.
Oh, huge money. Tens to hundreds of billions of dollars. Think Pfizer buying Warner Lambert years ago for $111.8 billion. Or the merger that formed GlaxoSmithKline GSK for $76 billion. More recently, Bristol-Myers Squibb bought Celgene for potentially up to $95 billion. Pfizer just bought Seagen, an oncology company, for $43 billion.
Wow.
These aren't small deals. They fundamentally reshape the industry structure. Motivations are often things like wanting to boost their drug portfolio, strengthen their position in lucrative areas like cancer or rare diseases, or simply acquire promising R&D pipelines from other companies.
And where does the U.S. fit in this global picture? Is it the biggest market?
By far. The U.S. market is dominant. Our sources consistently show it accounts for something like 30–40% of the global market, maybe 45% of global sales. It was valued at around $600 billion in 2023.
$600 billion.
Yeah. And projections show it growing significantly, potentially hitting over $2 trillion by the early 2030s, fueled partly by, an aging population and the rise of chronic diseases that need ongoing treatment.
That's an enormous market. And the industry always talks about how much it spends on R&D. Is that accurate?
It is incredibly R&D intensive. Companies typically report reinvesting somewhere between 15% and 20% of their U.S. revenues back into research and development. And the U.S. really leads global R&D spending in this sector, over $100 billion in 2021 alone, according to some sources.
Okay, so they spend a lot. But what's the actual cost of bringing a single new drug to market? That figure always seems to be debated and, frankly, kind of astronomical.
It is debated, and the estimates vary quite a bit depending on how you calculate it, what you include, but the numbers are definitely staggering. Recent estimates range from a median cost of around $700 million up to average or projected estimates climbing well over $2 billion per drug, especially when you factor in the cost of all the drugs that failed during development, which is most of them.
$2 billion for one drug. That's incredible. And that high cost and risk, that must drive their strategy, right?
Absolutely. Industry sources argue it forces them to focus strategically.
Focus on what?
Increasingly on high-value specialty drugs, particularly in areas like oncology cancer treatments, which makes up a big chunk of the market, maybe around 17% or so in the U.S. The thinking is that the premium pricing these specialized drugs can command is necessary to offset that enormous R&D investment and the very high risk of failure. Prescription medicines overall make up the vast majority of the U.S. market, over 87%.
And the big players are those familiar names.
Yeah, the top global companies are the ones you'd expect. Johnson & Johnson, Roche, Merck, Pfizer, AbbVie, GSK, Novartis, Sanofi. Those giants dominate.
But there's also pressure on their pricing, right? From the generics we talked about. And biosimilars.
Huge pressure. The success of Hatch-Waxman means, like we said, over 90% of prescriptions are sold by much cheaper generics once a brand name drug's patent runs out. And biosimilars are starting to provide similar competition for those complex biologic drugs. This creates this constant cycle. Brand name companies face price erosion from generics, so they have to keep investing heavily in new R&D or acquire new drugs through those mega mergers to refill their pipelines. It's relentless.
Okay, so we have incredible scientific leaps, a massive global market, huge R&D spending. But as we mentioned at the start, this industry also faces intense public scrutiny. Where does that tension primarily seem to lie?
Often it boils down to that intersection of innovation and profit. And the most visible sign of that tension is high drug costs. It's a major, persistent public concern. You see surveys consistently showing things like, nearly 80% of Americans find prescription drug costs unreasonable, and almost a quarter report struggling to afford their medications.
And the industry's defense is always those R&D costs we just discussed, that multi-billion-dollar figure per drug.
Yes, that's their primary justification for pricing. But critics like former New England Journal of Medicine editor Marcy Angel really push back hard. She's called the industry primarily a marketing machine and argues that greed, frankly, is a major factor inflating prices, especially in the U.S. compared to other wealthy countries where prices for the same drugs are often much lower.
Why is the U.S. so different on pricing?
Well, our sources point to a few key factors. Unlike many other developed nations, the U.S. government doesn't directly negotiate or regulate prices for most drugs across the board. We have a much more fragmented system. Companies are also often accused of gaming the patent system, using various strategies to extend their monopolies and keep generics off the market longer than the original patent intended.
Extending exclusivity.
Right. And there's also this issue some sources call the gross to net bubble. It's the growing gap between a drug's official list price and the much lower net price the manufacturer actually receives after all the confidential rebates and discounts are paid to insurers and pharmacy benefit managers. It makes the whole system very opaque.
Okay, so pricing is one huge area of scrutiny. What about the marketing side? You mentioned Marcy Angel calling it a marketing machine.
Yeah, this is another major flashpoint. Our sources indicate the industry spends roughly twice as much on marketing and sales promotion as it does on actual R&D.
Twice as much. Wow.
Yeah. And critics argue that a lot of what gets called research isn't truly independent scientific inquiry, but is actually marketing disguised as science studies designed to promote a drug rather than objectively evaluate it. Ben Goldacre, in his book Bad Pharma, makes some really strong arguments about how the evidence base for drugs can be systematically distorted. Through things like poorly designed clinical trials or selectively publishing positive results while burying negative or inconclusive ones. He gives this example of an antidepressant, reboxetine, where only 1 out of 7 trials actually showed it worked better than a placebo. But that was the only one that got published initially.
That is shocking. Withholding negative results completely distorts the picture for doctors and patients.
Absolutely. And then there's the direct influencing of doctors and medical journals. Sources mention Purdue Pharma spending something like $9 million annually just on providing food for doctors during sales visits or promotional lines. It shows the sheer scale of these efforts to influence prescribing.
And speaking of Purdue Pharma, that brings us to the opioid crisis. Probably the most devastating recent example of ethical lapses with truly catastrophic consequences.
Tragically so. I mean, the sources make it clear this crisis was fueled directly by Purdue Pharma and the Sackler family's aggressive and deeply misleading marketing of OxyContin. Despite knowing its highly addictive nature, they actively promoted it as non-addictive or having very low addiction risk. They hid those risks. The scale is just immense, contributing to the deaths of nearly 500,000 Americans.
And the sources contain details from internal documents, emails, memos that are just horrific in their callousness.
Yes, truly shocking stuff. Richard Sackler, who was president of Purdue, reportedly responded to an early report about dozens of OxyContin-related deaths in one state by writing in an email something like, "This is not too bad, it could have been far worse."
That level of stated indifference to human life, it's hard to comprehend.
It really is. And their sales tactics were equally aggressive, according to the evidence that came out.
How so?
Sales reps were given these huge, uncapped bonuses, sometimes over $150,000, $170,000 per quarter, specifically to target doctors who were maybe naive about addiction risks. or who were already high-volume prescribers of opioids. Purdue actively manufactured this narrative of a widespread pain epidemic that required aggressive opioid treatment, massively expanding the market for their drug.
And didn't they also kind of cynically look into the addiction treatment market itself?
Disturbingly, yes. Sources reveal internal discussions about how pain treatment and addiction are naturally linked, exploring opportunities in the addiction treatment space even as their product fueled the crisis. They consistently blamed the victims, the people who became addicted, rather than their own misleading marketing. They used false claims like that the drug provided smooth 12-hour relief, which often wasn't true, leading patients to take doses more frequently and actually increasing addiction rates.
And the Sackler family themselves.
They extracted billions of dollars from Purdue over the years, shielding much of their personal wealth through complex corporate structures, bankruptcy proceedings, and reportedly untraceable accounts, even as the company faced waves of lawsuits.
And that revolving door issue you mentioned earlier, where regulators sometimes end up working for the industry they regulated, was that visible here too?
Starkly visible, yes. There are documented cases, including an FDA regulator who played a key role in OxyContin's approval, who later left the FDA and took a high-paying executive job at Purdue.
That just raises so many questions about potential conflicts of interest and regulatory capture, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. And it undermines public trust.
And beyond specific products like OxyContin, the history of medical research itself has some really disturbing ethical chapters that highlight why current guidelines are so crucial.
Yes, it's important we don't forget those historical failures. The infamous Tuskegee syphilis study, where treatment was deliberately withheld from Black men for decades just to observe the disease's natural progression. Or U.S. government physicians infecting prisoners and mental patients in Guatemala with syphilis and gonorrhea in the 1940s without any consent, just to test penicillin. Giving hepatitis deliberately to children with developmental disabilities at the Willowbrook Institution in New York to study immune response. Even later examples, like studies in Uganda withholding proven AIDS drugs from HIV-positive pregnant women that could have prevented transmission to their newborns, raising huge ethical questions.
And you mentioned even Salk's early polio vaccine trials involved testing on unconsenting institutionalized subjects.
Yes, some of those early trials used populations that couldn't properly consent. These examples, stretching across decades, underscore just how hard-won the fundamental ethical principles we rely on today, like fully informed consent, actually are. They weren't always the standard.
And those conflicts of interest, you mentioned the revolving door. Industry funding, though, still persist as ongoing concerns, right? Beyond just the opioid crisis example.
Yeah. Yes, that revolving door between regulators at agencies like the FDA or CDC and the industry they oversee is a persistent structural concern. Also, the 1992 Prescription Drug User Fee Act, PDUFA, where the industry pays fees to the FDA to fund parts of the drug approval process while intended to speed up reviews, it has always raised fears about companies potentially buying approvals or unduly influencing the process.
Right, a perception issue.
Exactly. And you see former FDA commissioners moving to lucrative positions on pharmaceutical company boards or consulting firms. Drug trials funded directly by the manufacturer inherently create at least perceived conflicts of interest regarding the results. Former FDA Commissioner David Kessler himself warned years ago that the FDA was losing scientific independence due to things like budget cuts and increasing reliance on industry funding, potentially eroding its gold standard reputation. It's a systemic issue that demands ongoing scrutiny.
Listening to all this, it sounds like many of these ethical challenges, prioritizing profit over safety, manipulating information, aggressive marketing, they weren't entirely unique to the pharmaceutical industry, are they?
No, they aren't unique. You can see historical parallels in other industries that have significant public health impacts. Think about the food industry before regulation. Upton Sinclair's The Jungle exposed horrific conditions, leading directly to the Meat Inspection Act of 1906, the same year as the Pure Food and Drug Act. The automotive industry has had its scandals, the Ford Pinto case, where internal documents suggested the company calculated it was cheaper to pay off lawsuits for deaths from fiery crashes than to fix a known fuel tank defect. Or, more recently, Volkswagen's Dieselgate scandal, deliberately cheating on emissions tests.
And tobacco, of course.
Tobacco is perhaps the most notorious parallel, systematically undermining scientific evidence linking smoking to cancer, using misleading marketing, more doctors smoke Camels, and decades of litigation eventually exposed internal documents proving they knew about addiction and harm and deliberately hid it.
It's that same pattern again, isn't it? Initial lack of regulation.
Followed by scandals where profit seems prioritized over safety.
Leading to public outcry.
And then finally, reactive lawmaking. Industry resistance and attempts to manipulate the narrative are common threads across all these examples.
So addressing these deep-seated issues requires more than just punishing individuals after the damage is done.
It seems so. It likely needs structural changes to regulation, to the incentive systems, and to the fundamental relationships between industry, regulators, the scientific community, and the public they all ultimately serve.